Hello and welcome back to Saints of the Week. Here's the things that don't change for the 18th Sunday in Ordinary Time. Apologize for last week. I was not able to get a video out. Things were busy. We also were a bit behind on the podcast itself. But we're back this week with all the familiar stuff that you're used to. So without further ado, let's get right into the Saints of the Week here. We got quite a few to go through. The saint that we have today is Saint Jean-Marie Vianney, Saint John Vianney. So Saint John was born on the 8th of May in the year 1786 near Lyon in France. And he was the fourth of six children, and his parents were, very devout, Catholics in their own right, Matthew Vianney and Marie Belouse. During his childhood, the French Revolution broke out. So, he was born in 1786. The French Revolution broke out in 1789. So he was only a couple of years old when the revolution started. And of course, this was a very difficult time for the church in France. Difficult time for France in general, especially the church, because a lot of the leaders of the revolution were not necessarily fans of religion. Seeing that as kind of part of the ancien regime, kind of part of the same nobility, kind of kingly power of France that they were rebelling against. This, of course, kind of came to a head during the outbreak of the Reign of Terror, when a political group known as the Jacobins, they really kind of ramped up executions of Catholics and kind of martyrdoms. Martyring people, in their bloody guillotine campaigns. So it was kind of during this time, that Saint John Vianney, that he was, he was a child. He was kind of going through his formative years. Because of this, he had to study catechism in secret. They weren't really allowed to openly practice the faith in the same sort of way, or instruct their children in the faith. He received his first communion in the home of an anti-revolution priest, and then also, two nuns whose orders, they had been part of an order, that order had been dissolved by the revolution. They're kind of all in hiding, and it was during this that he received his first communion. And it was also during this time that he made his decision, that he was to become a priest, just very, taken by the humility and just the example of his parents and also of these, religious during this time. He found learning very difficult, especially, he needed to be tutored in Latin to kind of really get it. This, has been attributed to the fact that he wasn't really able to have regular schooling during the revolution, since all the religious schools and just a lot of the schools just weren't functioning in the same sort of capacity. So he kind of was starting off later on. And, he was just kind of starting off kind of from a deficit due to that. So he found an intercessor as he grew up in Father Ballet, who was the abbé in Écully in France, who was a local parish priest who advocated for him during his education. So eventually as he grew up, he still wanted to be a priest. So during his studies, however, he was drafted into the army of Napoleon. By this point in France, Napoleon Bonaparte had taken over and become emperor of France. And it was during this time the church was kind of allowed to have some of its previous splendor back. There was a concordat signed in the early 1800s with the Papal States. Obviously he was allowed to openly go to seminary. However, there were a lot of wars in France around this time, as basically all of Europe was trying to stop the spread of Napoleon and his empire. Seminarians were normally exempt from military duty. However, due to the due to just the time period and what was going on, this exemption was waived, and he was required, even though he was a seminarian, to join the army. His family tried to protest. His father tried to explain, to the regiment, like, look, this is what's going on. Can he be exempt from this? However, the request was denied, so he was forced to kind of go off and join the army, while it was on its way to fight in Spain, which at this point was ruled by Napoleon's brother. However, the British and some of the other powers were trying to fight them there and end that during the Peninsular War. However, the night before that, the regiment that John Vianney was a part of, the night before he was supposed to leave, he was in the chapel praying and, just spending all night in prayer, trying to figure out what he was to do, how he was supposed to handle this. And by the time he left the chapel, he found out that all the soldiers had actually left without him. The regiment had kind of forgotten about him, and they went off to war, without him present. So he tried to, go after them, because it was his duty to fight. However, he met a young man on the way who, said, yeah, I know which way, if you follow me, I'll bring you to them. However, he actually instead brought him to a village in the mountains, where a bunch of deserters from the French army were currently kind of taking refuge. And John Vianney ended up kind of living in this village for, a solid 14 months, where he kind of lived under assumed identity to, stop the army from finding him and pegging him as a deserter. It was also during this time, especially during the winter months, that a lot of people from outside came to this village, so he was kind of able to go fly under the radar for a bit. He worked at a school for children during this time, and there were several times when the people from the army did come looking for deserters. The people of the village would kind of hide him, so they wouldn't be able to find him. However, in the year 1810, the emperor issued a declaration pardoning all deserters, basically just a blanket a blanket decree that, hey, anyone who deserted from the French army, you're all pardoned. Don't worry about it. And you can kind of go about your lives. So, due to this, Jean-Marie was allowed to return to his home and continue his studies as a seminarian. He returned to the seminary in this time and struggled to kind of catch up because, again, this had been another gap in his education. So he continued to struggle with that. However, he was eventually ordained in the year 1815. Abbe Bale, Father Bale, who had been an intercessor for him early on, was somebody who still kind of really worked to help him, get ordained. And then after he was ordained, he was actually sent to École to serve with Father Bale until the latter's death in the year 1818. And it was at this time that Jean-Marie was sent as a parish priest to the town of Ars near Lyon. And it was kind of here that he gains kind of his fame as the curé of Ars, kind of the famous priest of that area. He founded an orphanage while he was here for destitute girls, which was named the Providence. And through this example, many others of a similar type started all over France. He would instruct the girls in the catechism, and his teachings in this and kind of his popularity as a preacher was eventually became so prominent that large crowds would kind of come to the church itself to hear these same kind of catechism studies that he was giving to the children. So it was also during his time that he became a very renowned spiritual director. He spent 16 to 18 hours a day in confession in the later years of his life, as the reports go, just because so many people kind of wanted to go to confession with him, wanted to see him, wanted to get direction. So he just devoted most of his time to this. His advice was sought by, bishops, priests, religious, laymen, and women. He was just known for great sanctity and great holiness in that. And the crowds kind of got to be so bad that in the year 1835, his bishop actually forbade him from attending the annual retreat of diocesan clergy. Because there was just so many people who wanted to see him personally, that, A, it would kind of detract from the other priests' retreat, and B, he had a duty to the people who were coming to see him that, was kind of seen as a very important thing that he needed to do. By the year 1855, the pilgrims had reached about 20,000 people a year coming to see him. And, amongst other things, what really drew people to him was his approach to spiritual direction. He just had really good insight. He was known to have a gift of reading souls, and he would actually even be able to know if somebody was withholding sins during confession. He drew insights in his advice from daily life, just very practical. He's also just known to be very soft-spoken, in his ways. He also had a reputation for many great miracles, including kind of miraculously obtaining money that he could then use to donate to the charities and buy food for orphans in his area. As we mentioned, the supernatural knowledge that he would have of people's past and present, and he just also other sins that they may have been trying to withhold from confession. So their confession would have been valid in that case, but he was able to kind of bring that forth and kind of bring that to their attention. And also, he was just known to have a great he was just known to be able to heal the sick, especially children. He had a unique ability to just kind of heal children who were afflicted with all kinds of illnesses. He died in the year 1859 on August the 4th at the age of 73. And this is during the height of his fame. Even at the age of 73, there were still many, many, many people coming to see him. He faced his death with simplicity and joy. He knew it was coming, but was ready to go see the Lord. He was beatified by Pope St. Pius X in the year 1905, and then canonized by Pope Pius XI in 1925. And it was also in 1928 that he was made the patron of parish priests. And his feast day is on August the 4th. The next saint that we have is Saint Cajetan. So Saint Cajetan was born in the year 1480 in Vicenza, which was part of Venetian territory at this time in northern Italy. He was raised by a very pious mother and was known as just a very intelligent young man. He received a doctorate at the University of Padua at the age of 24 and worked for some time as a lawyer. And it was during this time, kind of as a lawyer, he started to fall in with the court of Pope Julius II, who was reigning around this time. So he found himself in Rome, and it was during this time that he kind of helped reconcile the Republic of Venice and the Papal States, which during this time in Italy, the what was known as the Italian Wars was going on, where you had different Italian states at war with each other. The Pope was very involved in these wars, especially Pope Julius. The French were involved, the Spanish were involved, all the different city-states, Florence, Milan, Venice, they were kind of all involved in fighting each other, and and there's a lot of animosity, but also the alliances would change a lot. Where you have, somebody on one side, the Pope's aligned with Spain for some point, and the Pope's aligned with France for another part. At this point, the Papal States in Venice were kind of at odds, and, St. Cajetan was able to kind of bring some reconciliation there. In the year 1516, St. Cajetan was ordained a priest, and he returned to Vicenza when his mother died the next year in 1517. And it was here that he founded a hospital and just worked great charity amongst, the sick and poor in his hometown. And it was during this time that he became convicted to kind of help heal the spiritual diseases. He'd spent all this time kind of fighting physical diseases, but, just really saw the spiritual diseases that were infecting the clergy. Sorry. This is around the time of the great Renaissance popes who were very worldly in their office. You had a lot of popes who had children from illicit affairs and kind of were engaged in kind of various debaucheries. We mentioned wars. And a lot of the clergy, especially in Italy around this time, were kind of forsaking a lot of their duties and kind of a lot of what they were supposed to be focused on as priests. So seeing this, St. Cajetan, wanted to really help remedy a lot of this. So after Pope Julius' death in 1523, he founded an association of priests, which became known as the Oratory of Divine Love. And kind of the charism of this order was to kind of combine the spirit of monasticism with an active ministry kind of out in the world. Pope Clement the Seventh gave permission to kind of continue this in the next year, 1524. And a close companion and sponsor of his was Bishop Giovanni Pietro Carafa, who was the Bishop of Chieti, which is a bishopric in Italy. Chieti, also known as Theati in Latin. So the order that St. Cajetan founded kind of became known as the Theatines due to this close association with the bishop there. So the Theatines, they fled Rome in 1527 when invading armies were coming to sack the city. And they eventually settled in Venice, where they came into contact with St. Jerome Aemilian, who helped them kind of expand their order. In 1533, St. Cajetan founded a house in Naples and also spent a lot of time kind of combating Lutheranism, which never really took off in Italy in the same way it took off in Germany. However, there were pockets of it that sprung up. So, he kind of worked to kind of evangelize against Protestantism. So he returned to Venice to expand the houses, also in Verona and Vicenza, so his hometown, and also another city in the Republic of Venice. And then in 1517, he was back in Naples, where he died. He's beatified in the year 1629 by Pope Urban VIII, and then canonized in 1671 by Pope Clement X. And his feast day is on August the 7th. Next saint that we have today is Pope St. Sixtus II. So Pope Sixtus was born sometime in the late 2nd, early 3rd century. We're not exactly sure when. However, what we do know is that by the year 257, he was elected Pope. He was elected after Pope St. Stephen I, whose feast day is actually today, the date I'm recording this, August the 2nd, at least in the older 1962 calendar. I'm not sure about the 1970. However, getting back to it, so Pope St. Stephen I was martyred in that year. The story of his martyrdom goes, that he was preaching, in his cathedra, in his chair, during a persecution of the church, and they came in and beheaded him right in his chair. And then the chair was, venerated, still stained with his blood, kind of venerated as a holy spot for many centuries afterwards. So after Pope St. Stephen was killed, Sixtus was elected Pope, and there was currently a dispute going on in the church since the days of his predecessor over the rebaptism of heretics. There are issues kind of going on between the church in Rome and also the churches in Africa and Asia. St. Stephen kind of had strained relationships with a lot of these churches because of this, because he took the controversial stance that there was no need to rebaptize heretics and that the baptisms by heretics are still valid. If it's a valid Trinitarian baptism, doesn't matter who's doing the baptism, it is a valid baptism. So he was very unpopular for this, St. Stephen was. However, he had a bit more of a fiery style. When Sixtus took over, he was a bit more conciliatory with the dissenters and friendly, but again, still held fast to the same position as Stephen did. That there's no need to rebaptize, and the baptisms from heretics were perfectly valid. It was also during this time that the persecutions of the Emperor Valerian continued. This was the emperor who had Stephen beheaded. He basically put forth an edict for forcing Christians to participate in the sacrifice of the pagan gods. Of course, Christians were very famous for the fact that they abstained from this worship. Amongst other pagan groups, since paganism didn't necessarily care different, even if you had different gods, you would still kind of offer sacrifice to the Roman gods, just because they are other gods that you might be able to get stuff from. But as Christians, we only believe in one God, so there's no sacrificing to other gods. So this, of course, raised a lot of concerns with the pagans, and was the cause of a lot of the persecutions that ended up arising. So Valerian issued an edict kind of forbidding Christians to gather because of this, unless they would, sacrifice to the pagan gods. Sixtus managed to continue his ministry despite this. However, in the next year, in 258, another edict came down decreeing that all bishops, priests, and deacons were to be executed immediately on sight. Sixtus, continuing his ministry, was assembling his flock one day at a lesser-known cemetery, not a cemetery that the Romans knew about, but kind of a lesser-known Christian cemetery where they could meet kind of more in private. It was a cemetery to St. Praxiteles, and they, worshipped here in an attempt to steer clear of the Romans. However, the soldiers did find them regardless, and apprehended Pope Stephen while he was seated and preaching the congregation, much like his predecessor. He may have been beheaded on the spot like his predecessor. However, it's also more likely that he was probably brought back, kind of put on like a bit of a sham trial type thing, and then brought back to the cemetery again, and then executed at the cemetery. So he was executed there also with several deacons, including Januarius, also Deacon Vincentus, Magnus, and Stephanus. And then there was also two deacons, Felicissimus and Agapitus, who were executed on that same day, not in the same cemetery. However, all those deacons and Pope Sixtus, they all share the same feast day as Pope Sixtus and companions. That cemetery continued to become a pilgrimage spot going forward, in honor of these great martyrs who defied the persecutions of the emperor. And his feast day is on August the 7th. Next saint that we have, pretty big name, is Saint Dominic. So Saint Dominic was born in Calaroga, which is in Castile, so in Spain, in the year 1170. He was born to, his father was Felix Guzman, and his mother was Joanna of Aza. They were both members of the Castilian nobility. And he was raised in a very holy family. His parents and brothers, again, all had a reputation for great sanctity. His mother is actually currently a blessed. She's was beatified in 1828 by Pope Leo XII. And I believe also one of his brothers is also currently a blessed. So again, very holy family that he was raised in. A popular legend says that his mother made a pilgrimage to an abbey at Salus before his birth and received signs that she would bear a great child. And then later had a dream of a dog leaping from her womb with a torch in its mouth, meant to set fire to the earth, which has since become a very famous image that you commonly see with Saint Dominic is, a dog, cut to, set fire to the earth. He's commonly associated with the dog, so are the Dominican order themselves. There's actually a song by the Hillbilly Thomists, which, is a bluegrass band consisting of all Dominicans from the province of St. Joseph here in the northeastern United States. There's actually a song that they have called I'm a Dog, and basically just kind of explaining how you're a dog for the Lord, in honor kind of this idea of the Dominicans as kind of dogs for Christ. So anyway, St. Dominic was educated in Palencia at the university there, and he focused his study on theology and the arts. He was known as a very exemplary student, very, very intelligent, very good student. He was also known for his great charity. In 1191, a great famine spread through Spain, and he sold everything that he had to buy food to the poor and kind of help alleviate some of the suffering. He also, it's said that he willingly sold himself into slavery on at least 2 occasions. To the Moors, so the Muslims who ruled southern Spain at this time. He sold himself willingly into slavery in order to pay to have others released from slavery. So in the year 1194, he joined the Benedictines and became superior of his chapter of the Benedictines in the year 1201. In the year 1203, he was asked by the King of Castile to travel to Denmark along with his Bishop Diego de Acebo. And kind of the purpose of their journey was to speak to the King of Denmark and come up with a marriage agreement between the Princess of Denmark and also the Crown Prince of Castile. So they went to Denmark. However, the princess died of an illness when they arrived before they could leave for Spain. So they left, but kind of now had some time on their hands on their way back to Spain. So they ended up stopping in Rome in the year 1204. And it was here that they went because Bishop Diego wanted to resign from his post as bishop. He kind of would rather preach to unbelievers. He kind of wanted to go kind of preach to unbelievers, whether, in the Middle East or, in parts of Europe that had yet to hear the faith. However, the Pope Benedict III, who was Pope at this time, kind of didn't want to send them off to these dangerous lands and denied that request. However, instead, he sent both of them to southern France to combat the Albigensians, also known as the Cathars, which had become a very popular heresy around this time. Now, the Cathars, also known as the Albigensians, sometimes they hear about the Albigensian Crusade, sometimes they hear about the Cathars. These are both the same groups. They were heretics with a very Gnostic sense of the world. So Gnosticism, we talked about before, it's a very common idea in the ancient church and still kind of rears its head every now and again in history. Basically, it's the idea that the material world is all bad and all corrupt and all sinful, and the spiritual world is good and holy and righteous and should be pursued. So they commonly believe in kind of the demiurge, which is the evil god of the world who created all of these material things that we have, as opposed to the spiritual God, who is God of the spiritual world, who we want to aspire to be like. Which, of course, is very much against the Christian idea of God, in that he created everything. Right, so everything is a creation of God. However, due to sin, that's why we have suffering and corruption and all of that stuff. So the Cathars believed in this Gnostic sense of the world, and they had a lot of strange views on the gospel, on Jesus, kind of on biblical teaching. They denied the incarnation and also the resurrection, since the created world is evil, so Jesus would not be evil. So they thought of him actually as an angel who was only taking on the form of a man, right? He was, spiritual in all of his essence, but was just looking like a man to speak to people. They also, interestingly enough, saw John the Baptist as an evil figure, in that he was trying to hinder Jesus, the angelic spiritual Jesus, and then also teaching this false sacrament of baptism. Of course, this created thing, pouring water, which is created on people, would not be right. The Albigensians, the Cathars, also hated sex and saw it as something evil in all cases. They did not partake in sex if they could. They were against procreation because they just saw that as bringing more souls into this fallen, irredeemable evil world. They had only one sacrament in kind of their rites, which was known as consolamentum. And this sacrament, they believed, would kind of purge the believer of sin and make them into a higher being, a perfect, as they called it. So kind of similar to baptism in the idea that baptism cleanses us of sin. However, obviously this isn't a physical thing because they see the physical world as not good. So this consolamentum was done near death because the way they saw it, the demands of living a perfect life were so difficult that it would only happen right before you died, because if you lived longer, that you would just fall back into the same corruption that you were in before. And there were some reports, again, some people will dispute this. There's a lot of controversy on the beliefs of the Albigensians because a lot of the sources we have are sources from the Christians, from the Dominicans, and a lot of people, especially nowadays, don't trust them. Again, you could go either way on that. In a lot of cases, there were a lot of Dominicans writing in good faith kind of about people who they saw as wrong, obviously, but they treated them with respect. So the church wouldn't necessarily say that just because they disagree with them that their views on the Cathars were completely just made up. Clearly, they believed some of these things that needed to be come back in some way, shape, or form. But anyway, it was said by some that because the belief was that if you're in this perfect state, having received consolamentum, if you recovered from your illness, you were destined to fall back into your evil, sinful ways. So they would say that some would either commit suicide in order to not, continue living, or that they would then be suffocated to death. If it looked like they were super sick, got the sacrament, and then started recovering, they would just kill the person outright so that they would free them from the bonds of the physical world. So again, a group with a lot of ideas that were very much against the Catholic Christian idea of, basically how the world works, basically everything. So this had to be combated because it was leading a lot of people to possibly do some very evil things by killing people, and also just leading a lot of souls away from the truth, which, especially in this day and age, was very important to have, not just religious orthodoxy, but then also that would spur about good social orthodoxy, right? The church and state were very intertwined, so this was seen as both a threat to the state and also a threat to the church. So up until this point, the Cistercians had been tasked with combating the Albigensians. However, they've had little success. It was said that a lot of the Cistercians were kind of worldly in their methods. They had a lot of material trappings around them as they went. And of course, the Cathars, not being fans of the material world, that wasn't very helpful, seeing these priests filled with the material world all around them. So Dominic and Diego, when they arrived, they were seen as much more austere because they lived very simple lives. They were also very self-disciplined and kind of give in to a lot of those excesses. So the Cathars were a lot more willing to listen to them. They respected them a lot more. They preached and were dismissed by many, but also won many repentant converts, through their preaching. And it became clear that, some sort of religious institution needed to kind of be founded in southern France to kind of help combat this. To kind of educate the nobility so that they were more formed in their faith. They were able to kind of more combat that in their own lives. Also to raise the children in a very solid Catholic faith so that they wouldn't, kind of go off and start flirting with these other incorrect Cathar ideas. So Dominic established a monastery in Proille in 1206. And then that monastery still exists as the Notre Dame de Proille Monastery. In the year 1208, the kind of the Albigensian movement, kind of the tensions between them and the other, Catholics really kind of started heating up because there was a papal legate that was murdered by the Cathars around this time. And this, of course, enraged many people. And the French nobility took up arms to kind of combat them at this point with Simon de Montfort, who was a part of the French nobility, kind of the spearheaded guy who led this effort. So this became what is known as the Albigensian Crusade, a crusade kind of brought up against these heretics in southern France. So Dominic did his best to appeal for mercy amidst all of this. A lot of the Crusaders, obviously they're going to war now, so there's a lot of abuses, kind of a lot of people being killed outright, and just a lot of violence going on. So Dominic did his best to kind of appeal for mercy for the heretics and kind of work kind of a more peaceful solution to this issue. He was known to follow the armies around and just kind of reconcile any survivors he could find and kind of reconcile people to the church. He became friends with Simon, and was just known to kind of do his best to work to help convert the souls of the Cathars without seeing them killed. He was very much against that happening. It's also during this time that he was said to have been given the rosary by Our Lady in 1214 in his chapel. There were a lot of similar devotions around this time to the Blessed Virgin Mary, of course. However, the rosary itself wasn't a thing until after this. So Saint Dominic is the one who, it seems, was able to kind of take that devotion and then bring it to people to start practicing. He was desired around this time as a bishop. People really wanted him to kind of take over as bishop in plenty of places. However, he denied each of these assignments. He did not want to be bishop at all. His true desire, however, was to create an order dedicated to promoting morality and destroying heresy. So in 1215, he was given permission to form this order. He started out with 6 initial followers, and they had a very strict discipline of prayer and penance. And they would travel the countryside kind of preaching. In 1216, Pope Honorius III officially confirmed this order and started referring to them as the Order of Preachers. And then in 1217, the next year, he sent what was now 17 of his followers all over Europe, asking for new members, asking for help in kind of establishing this Order of Preachers. He was very successful in this, and the Order of Preachers started growing exponentially. Pope Honorius issued a bull also around this time decreeing that all clergy were to support this order. So of course, word of the Pope really helped spread the word about this. Dominic helped renew lax disciplines of a community of nuns in Rome. And kind of due to this, he kind of gave up his church for this kind of community. So without a church now, Saint Sabina in Rome was given to kind of the Dominicans, as they were known, to kind of be their head church. And till this day, the Saint Sabina is the mother church of the Dominican order. So they originally used the rule of St. Augustine in their preaching. However, the Dominicans produced a more formal constitution around the year 1220, 1221. They had a superior who was elected for only a limited time. And then also, their order would only support it on the alms of people who would donate to them. And preaching and studying kind of was ingrained as the main focus of their order. In 1221, St. Dominic took ill with fever and asked to be laid on the ground, as he always did, because he kind of eschewed sleeping in a bed. And then he died in August of that year, on August 6th of 1221, and then was canonized not too long later by Pope Gregory IX. And his feast day is on August the 8th. Now, the final saint that we have today is Saint Teresa Benedicta of the Cross, who is more popularly known as Edith Stein. So Edith Stein was born on the 12th of October in the year 1891 in Breslau in Germany, currently the modern-day Polish city of Wrocław. She was the youngest of 11 children, born on Yom Kippur to a Jewish family. She was born to a very large Jewish family. She was a gifted child who was very close with her mother. Being born on Yom Kippur, her mother was very devout, and that always kind of was very close to her heart. So her and her mother were very close. As a teenage, Edith Stein, she drifted from Judaism and became an agnostic. She studied at the University of Breslau during her studies, and eventually in the year 1913 moved to the University of Göttingen to continue her studies, and eventually went on to study for a doctorate of philosophy under Edmund Husserl, who was kind of a popular kind of a German philosopher around this time. And her thesis that she took up was on empathy. Her studies were interrupted by World War I, which broke out in 1914. So during this time, she served as a volunteer with the Red Cross, and just ended up seeing a lot of suffering, kind of working in a typhus ward, kind of just became very aware of human suffering, through this work. In the year 1916, she moved to Freiburg, where she continued her studies under Husserl, and, eventually ended up getting a doctorate in the year 1917. And then for many years, was kind of worked as an assistant under Professor Husserl. So while she was in Frankfurt after graduating, she saw a woman. She had this experience where she saw a woman from the market, just a regular old German woman who she didn't know, just kind of take a couple minutes to step into the cathedral to pray. And this is something that always really stuck with her. In her words, she said, "This was something totally new to me. In the synagogues and Protestant churches I had visited, people simply went to the services. Here, however, I saw someone coming straight from the busy marketplace into this empty church, as if she was going to have an intimate conversation. It was something I never forgot." So she was just very struck kind of by the fact that this woman seemed to just be treating religion as this, hey, I'm just going to go pop in for a couple of minutes to kind of talk to somebody, and talk to a friend of mine type thing. And that's just not something that she knew from Judaism or the Protestants who she was familiar with. She was friends. She did have a family of Protestant converts who she was friends with, who were very deeply committed, spiritually committed to Christ. And this did also interest her, in addition to this experience in Frankfurt that she had. In 1918, she left work under Husserl to go pursue independent studies. She really wanted to become a professor. However, around this time, women weren't really usually allowed to become professors. And although Husserl did kind of recommend her as a very highly and very gifted student, she was denied becoming a professor, part because she was a woman, but also because she was Jewish. She was of Jewish heritage. She returned to Breslau around this time and began writing articles about philosophy and psychology. And it was during this time that she began reading the New Testament and also reading Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard and also the works of St. Ignatius of Loyola. And in 1921, she was spending weeks with a friend of hers, Hedwig Conrad Martius, who was a Protestant convert, however, again, very faithful family. And it was during her time, living with this family, that she took up reading a copy of St. Teresa of Avila's autobiography, and just completely was engrossed by this book and spent kind of all night reading through the whole thing. And, as she said, when I had finished reading this book, I said to myself, this is the truth. So very quickly after that, in 1922, she was baptized on January the 1st, which at that point in time was also the feast of the circumcision of Jesus. So again, a very a very Jewish feast day in the sense that, that was kind of a mark of Jesus coming into the Jewish faith. So as her, who was born a Jew, although she had stopped practicing, that was something that seems very important to her. And then was confirmed some weeks later by the Bishop of Speyer on the Feast of the Purification of Mary. Again, another Jewish feast, kind of commemorating Mary, being purified and able to re-enter the temple after birth. So she really wanted to join a Carmelite convent. However, her spiritual directors advised her otherwise. They wanted her to continue preaching in the world, kind of engaging with people and kind of dialoguing with people kind of in her field of study. Instead, she ended up teaching German and history at a Dominican sister school, and kind of eventually asked to kind of speak publicly by her bishop on women's issues kind of around the diocese. And it was after, being asked to do this that she's recorded as saying, during the time immediately before and quite some time after my conversion, I thought that leading a religious life meant giving up all earthly things and having one's mind fixed on divine things only. Gradually, however, I learned that other things are expected of us in this world. I even believe that the deeper someone is drawn to God, the more he has to get beyond himself. In this sense, that is, to go into the world and carry divine life into it. So that kind of goes to show that, like, as she started kind of doing these different tasks that were asked of her, kind of going out and teaching people in the world, she started to realize that the reasons that she wanted to enter the religious life at that point were kind of just to shut herself away and, praise God, which commendable. However, she wanted to kind of hide from the world as opposed to kind of separate herself from the world for the sake of God. It was kind of, she kind of came to the realization that, being out in the world and able to bring the gospel to people was something just as worthy as, kind of the religious life. So over the next couple of years, while she was doing this work, she spent time translating the letters and diaries of Cardinal John Henry Newman, soon to become, as of the present day, soon to become a doctor of the church, and also the works of St. Thomas Aquinas into German. So she would commonly take a retreat with the Benedictines at Beron, at the monastery there. Eventually, she became a lecturer at the Catholic Division of the German Institute for Educational Studies at the University of Münster in 1932. However, this was cut short in the next year, 1933, when the Nazis came to full power and Adolf Hitler was elected chancellor. So very soon after this, life became very hard for those of Jewish descent. Basically, all the avenues of public life were now cut off to her as somebody of Jewish descent. As she said it in her own words, I had heard of severe measures against Jews before, but now it dawned on me that God had laid his hand heavily on his people, and that the destiny of these people would also be mine. So she just realized that even though now she was a Catholic, the fact that she was born Jewish and still had many loved ones of the Jewish faith, especially her mother, that she would kind of continue to be a very important part of her life. So she couldn't continue teaching due to this. So now it was kind of clear that the convent was kind of the only avenue for her going forward. So she was able to enter a Carmelite convent at this time. She arrived in Breslau for the last time during these years, saying goodbye to her mother and family before she entered the convent. It was a very tearful parting. It also coincided with the Feast of Tabernacles, which is a very big Jewish feast. So her mother, who loved her very much, struggled with her conversion because her mother, up until the end, was a very devout Jewish woman. And by becoming Catholic, Edith Stein kind of, not that her mother thought that she forsook, was angry that she forsook her Jewishness or something like that. But her mother had a lot of issues with Christianity. Her mother was recorded with saying, I quote, I don't want to say anything against him, meaning Jesus. He may have been a very good person, but why did he have to make himself God? Just that, I would have been able to respect Jesus, but making himself equal with God is just not something I can square. So Edith Stein, after this very painful parting with her family, entered the convent on October the 14th in 1933. And this is when she took on the name Sister Teresa Benedicta of the Cross as kind of her, name as a religious sister. She said, quote, I understand the cross is the destiny of God's people, which was beginning to be apparent at that time, 1933. I felt that those who understood the cross of Christ should take upon it themselves on everyone's behalf. Of course, I know better now that what it means to be wedded to the Lord is a sign of the cross. However, one can never comprehend it because it is a mystery. So this just kind of goes to show that amidst this era of increasing Nazi rule, she saw the cross as something that had become very important to her and her people, both Catholics and especially Jews going forward through this time. In 1936, her mother passed away. And although her mother was a faithful Jew right up until her death, Edith really trusted to the mercy of Christ and truly believed that her mother did make it to heaven, and prayed for her intercession. from that point forward. In 1938, she made her final profession as a sister. Also in the year, a lot of the more difficult laws to the Jews really started to become evident, in Nazi Germany. It became clear that Jews were not going to be allowed to do anything. Whispers of imprisonment and things like that started to become really prevalent. So the nuns of her monastery actually had her smuggled out of Germany and instead brought across the Dutch border to the Carmelite convent in Echt in the Netherlands. So she spent some of her final years there. She wrote her final will and testament during this time. And as she said, quote, "Even now I accept the death that God has prepared for me in complete submission and joy as being his most holy will for me. I ask the Lord to accept my life and my death, so that the Lord will be accepted by his people and that his kingdom may come in glory for the salvation of Germany and the peace of the world." So again, during this time, it became very clear to her, even though she was now in the Netherlands, that her fate would be that of the Jewish people. She would probably not survive the war. She finished studying John of the Cross. She'd been doing a deep dive research into St. John of the Cross during this time, and it was this time that she finished that. Also, she wrote a lot of, some of her final works during this time. In the year 1940, the Nazis invaded the Netherlands and kind of took over control of that country. And for a time, they left Jewish converts alone, like, Catholics, Christians who came from a Jewish background. They're Christian now, so they didn't mess with them just yet. However, Edith, again, was very sure that she, one way or another, would not end up surviving the war. And in 1942, this happens in that the Dutch Bishops' Conferences, right? So the kind of the USCCB of the Dutch around this time, they released a public statement kind of decrying Nazism and decrying the racism of Nazism. And the message that they kind of prepared was to be read at all the churches in the Netherlands on that Sunday. And because of this, the Nazis were very angry with this, and they had all of the Jewish people who had become Christian, they had them all rounded up and carted off. And of course, Edith Stein, St. Teresa, Benedicta of the Cross, was one of these women. On August 2nd, 1942, while she was at chapel with her religious sisters, she was rounded up by the Nazis who came and arrested her. And also with her own blood sister, Rosa, who had become a member of this community and converted to Catholicism also, she was also rounded up with Edith Stein. And they are brought to Auschwitz, and very quickly after that, probably around August the 9th, were put in the gas chambers and murdered by the Nazis at Auschwitz. In 1987, she's beatified by Pope St. John Paul II, and then canonized 10 years later in the year 1988, also by Pope St. John Paul II. And she's seen as a martyr for the faith, which tends to be a bit controversial, especially amongst Jews, because she was killed for being Jewish. So why are they considering her a martyr for the Catholic faith? Because she wasn't killed for being Catholic. And again, it's a bit unclear because, once you're at Auschwitz and the Nazis were killing people, Jews were their main focus, obviously, 6 million Jews killed in the Holocaust, but they're also Catholics and disabled and communists and all these other people who were also seen as abhorrent to the Nazis, who were also murdered, in these gas chambers. So she was, in the way Pope St. John Paul II would put it, she was seen as a martyr in the sense that she was steadfastly devoted to Christ, who also himself was Jewish. So, kind of a martyr in the sense that, she's a member of the people of Christ in a kind of a, that spiritual way, as the church being the new Israel of the covenant, the new covenant. But anyway, and her feast day is on August the 9th. Now, that's all we got for today. Bit of a longer one. Like I said, a lot of great saints, lot to go into. Hope you guys all have a blessed week, and I will see you all next week.